What if the most dangerous force in human history is not fate itself, but the moment you believe you can outsmart it? There is a paradox hidden in the story of Oedipus, one that most people miss because they focus on events instead of systems. The real question is not what happened to him, but why resistance itself becomes the engine of collapse. Why does trying to avoid a predicted outcome seem to pull you directly into it? To understand this, you don't need mythology first. You need a mindset shift. Imagine receiving information that claims a specific future about you, something absolute, something irreversible. In most human systems, that moment of knowledge does not create freedom. It creates distortion. You stop reacting to reality and start reacting to the fear of what reality might become. And that shift is where the loop begins. This is the first contradiction. The oracle does not need to force anything. It only needs to be believed. That belief alone restructures behavior. And Oedipus is not a story about a man being punished by gods. It is a psychological case study of a mind under informational pressure. A mind that believes it is rational, but is actually navigating through fear-based inference. Here is the first memory fragment: a prophecy is spoken. Not as a command, but as information. Yet from that moment, every decision becomes reactive instead of free. The subject begins to move, not toward truth, but away from imagined disaster. Now ask yourself, what kind of system turns avoidance into inevitability? This is where the scale shifts. We are no longer talking about an individual. We are talking about a structure where knowledge arrives too early for the mind to process, but too late to change the outcome. A cognitive timing failure embedded inside human decision-making itself. And here is the second contradiction: Oedipus does everything right. He escapes, he investigates, he avoids danger. But every rational action is built on a corrupted assumption, because the original input has already rewritten his perception of risk. So the question becomes uncomfortable: is he free at all, or just responding correctly to the wrong model of reality? This is where the real insight emerges. When humans receive a belief that feels absolute, they don't simply follow it. They reorganize their entire decision tree around it. The future is no longer something unknown, it becomes something they actively negotiate with every action. And that negotiation is where consequences begin to form. Because in systems like this, the outcome is not imposed from outside. It is assembled from inside the reaction patterns themselves. Each attempt to avoid a predicted path strengthens the probability of walking it. A memory fragment appears here: a man runs from a future he has never seen. Every road he takes feels like choice. But each choice is quietly shaped by the shadow of what he is trying to avoid. And now the deeper consequence reveals itself. If avoidance can generate outcome, then what we call fate might not be a force at all. It might be a feedback loop between fear and action, between knowledge and misinterpretation. So we arrive at the real tension. Not can fate be escaped, but something more unsettling. What if the moment you believe you understand your future is the moment you begin constructing it without realizing? And if that is true, then the oracle is not hiding the future. It is hiding something far more dangerous. The mechanism by which the human mind turns information into inevitability. The deeper problem is not that humans receive predictions about their future, it's that they cannot stop reorganizing their identity around them. So the question becomes sharper now: what actually changes when a person believes their outcome is already known? To understand this, we have to move beyond action and into something more fragile: perception under pressure. In systems like this, knowledge does not behave like information. It behaves like gravity. It bends decision-making long before any action is taken. And once perception bends, reality doesn't need to force anything anymore. The core conflict shifts here: it is no longer fate versus free will. It becomes interpretation versus resistance to interpretation. Because the moment Oedipus hears the structure of his supposed future, something subtle breaks inside the decision process. Not morality. Not logic. But the neutral space where choices are supposed to remain unweighted. And this is where most people misunderstand him. They assume he is reacting to destiny. But he is actually reacting to meaning under threat. A memory fragment surfaces here. A man hears a prediction about destruction. He does not stop living his life. But every interaction begins to carry hidden weight. A glance becomes evidence. A coincidence becomes signal. A normal road becomes suspect. Nothing external has changed. But everything internal has. Now the contradiction deepens. The oracle does not give instructions. It does not intervene. It simply introduces a structure of interpretation that cannot be ignored once perceived. And that structure begins to reorganize how reality is filtered. So the question shifts again: if perception is already altered, can any action still be considered free? This is where scale expands. We are no longer looking at an individual trapped in prophecy. We are looking at a cognitive system where belief acts as a recursive engine. Each interpretation reinforces the emotional urgency of the next interpretation. Fear becomes input. Input becomes behavior. Behavior becomes confirmation. A second memory fragment: a traveler changes direction to avoid danger. But the new path only makes the original warning feel more real. Not because the warning was true, but because avoidance creates patterns that resemble truth. This is the silent mechanism at work in the story. Not punishment. Not divine enforcement. But feedback amplification. And here is the revelation that destabilizes everything: the oracle's power is not prediction. It is timing distortion. It introduces information at a moment when the mind is least capable of holding it neutrally. Too early for wisdom. Too late for flexibility. And that gap forces interpretation to replace understanding. Once that happens, consequence is no longer imposed. It is assembled. And this leads to the most unsettling realization yet: Oedipus is not being pushed toward a fixed ending. He is constructing a narrowing corridor of possibility with every attempt to widen his escape. The more he resists, the more structured his world becomes. Not because the world is rigid, but because his perception of it is collapsing into certainty. Now the consequence becomes psychological rather than mythological. When humans believe they are inside a defined outcome, they stop testing alternatives freely. They begin optimizing within fear boundaries instead of reality boundaries. And that shift is irreversible once it stabilizes. So the greater question emerges: if a single piece of interpreted information can reorganize an entire life path, then what part of human freedom is actually untouched? And more dangerously, is the oracle revealing fate, or simply revealing the limits of how the human mind survives knowing too much, too soon? The collapse does not begin when the truth is revealed. It begins when the mind can no longer tell the difference between truth and interpretation. So the question now is no longer about whether information changes destiny. The question is why human perception turns information into structure even when no structure was intended. At this stage, something critical emerges in the system we have been following. It is not the prophecy that shapes behavior. It is the mind's inability to hold uncertainty without converting it into direction. And this is where the crisis becomes unavoidable. Because once interpretation becomes automatic, every neutral event becomes loaded. Every coincidence becomes evidence. Every delay becomes signal. Reality stops being experienced and starts being decoded. The contradiction intensifies here. The more Oedipus tries to act freely, the more his actions begin to feel like confirmation of something already decided. But this is not external control. This is internal compression. The mind narrowing its own field of possible meaning until only one narrative remains stable enough to survive cognitive pressure. A memory fragment appears again. A person receives a single statement about their future. Nothing changes immediately. But over time, every unrelated event begins to feel connected. The world does not move differently. The mind does. Now the escalation becomes systemic. We are no longer dealing with a single individual reacting to a prediction. We are dealing with a cognitive architecture where uncertainty cannot remain undefined for long. It must be resolved into structure, even if that structure is false. And here is the first fracture in perception: if the mind insists on converting uncertainty into meaning, then the origin of meaning becomes irrelevant. What matters is only stability. This is where the system begins to invert itself. Because what was originally external information becomes internal pressure. And what was internal uncertainty becomes external destiny. Another memory fragment surfaces, a traveler begins to see patterns in every decision path. Not because the paths contain patterns, but because the mind cannot tolerate randomness. Gradually, every choice feels preloaded with consequence, even before it is made. At this point, contradiction becomes unbearable. If every interpretation reinforces a single trajectory, then freedom does not disappear in one moment. It disappears through repetition. Through subtle reinforcement. Through the quiet acceptance that meaning must exist somewhere, even when it does not. And that is where escalation peaks. The oracle no longer functions as a source of prediction. It functions as a trigger for cognitive overorganization. A single input expands into a system of interpretation that cannot be reversed once it stabilizes. So the real consequence is not that the future is fixed. The consequence is that the mind stops treating the future as open once it believes it has seen its outline. And this leads to the most dangerous shift yet. Reality does not need to enforce the prophecy. The mind begins to enforce it on itself through consistency-seeking behavior. Each step becomes less about exploration and more about alignment with perceived structure. But here is the fracture that changes everything. What if the structure was never in the prediction, but in the human need to eliminate ambiguity at any cost? And if that is true, then the most unsettling question emerges: is fate something imposed on consciousness, or something consciousness generates the moment it refuses to live without certainty? The real turning point is not when the mind begins to interpret reality, but when it realizes that interpretation itself is the mechanism shaping what it sees. So the question now becomes unavoidable: if perception is constantly restructuring itself around meaning, then where does the original signal actually end and distortion begin? This is where the revelation finally breaks through the previous layers of uncertainty. The oracle is not operating as a predictor of events, and not even as a trigger of human fear. Its true function is far more structural. It introduces a fixed narrative scaffold into an otherwise fluid mental system, and once that scaffold exists, the mind does the rest of the construction automatically. What appears to be destiny is actually cognitive completion behavior. The moment Oedipus receives the prophecy, nothing in the external world forces a direction. Instead, the mind begins to stabilize around a single coherent interpretation of danger. And coherence, once formed, becomes more powerful than truth itself. This is the revelation that redefines everything. The prophecy does not need to be accurate in a literal sense. It only needs to be stable enough to anchor interpretation. Once anchored, perception organizes itself to reduce ambiguity, even at the cost of contradiction. A memory fragment emerges here, a mind encountering a single structured warning, then slowly reorganizing unrelated events into a single continuous line of meaning, until randomness is no longer experienced as randomness, but as confirmation. Now the deeper insight becomes visible. Human consciousness is not optimized for uncertainty. It is optimized for resolution. When ambiguity persists too long, the mind begins constructing explanatory continuity, even if that continuity is fictional. This is not error. It is survival logic. Meaning stability is prioritized over accuracy. And this is where the true influence of the oracle becomes clear. It does not dictate outcomes. It dictates interpretive pressure. It forces the mind into a state where every choice must belong to a story, and once a story exists, deviation becomes psychologically expensive. The consequence of this is subtle but absolute. Oedipus is not trapped by the future. He is trapped by the necessity of making the future intelligible. Every action is evaluated not by what it is, but by what it appears to confirm within the emerging narrative structure. Another memory fragment surfaces, a person revisiting neutral events after forming a belief about their outcome, and suddenly experiencing those same events as if they had always pointed in one direction, even though nothing in the events themselves has changed. Now the scale shifts again. This is no longer mythology. This is a model of cognition under narrative constraint. Entire systems of belief, culture, and even history can emerge from the same mechanism, a single interpretive anchor that organizes scattered data into irreversible meaning. And here lies the deeper consequence. If meaning stabilization overrides raw perception, then truth is not the primary driver of human action. Narrative coherence is. This leads to a disturbing reversal. What we call fate may simply be the byproduct of minds refusing to tolerate unresolved ambiguity for too long. And once that refusal stabilizes, behavior begins to align with the story that feels most complete, not the reality that is most accurate. So the revelation expands beyond Oedipus himself. The oracle is not hiding a future that cannot be escaped. It is revealing a hidden dependency within consciousness itself, the need to convert uncertainty into narrative closure, even when that closure becomes self-defeating. And if that dependency is universal, then the final question is no longer about prophecy at all. It becomes a question about whether human perception can ever remain open without collapsing into the stories it creates. The question that remains is no longer about how perception distorts reality, but why the human mind is structured in a way that requires distortion to function at all. Because at this point, something fundamental becomes unavoidable. The system is not broken. It is operating exactly as designed. The core revelation is this: human consciousness does not experience reality directly. It experiences reality through a continuous process of narrative compression. Every fragment of information must be converted into meaning, and every meaning must be stabilized into a story. Without that stabilization, perception collapses into noise. This is the hidden mechanism beneath everything we have been tracing. The oracle, in this framework, is not an external force imposing destiny. It is a mirror that reveals the internal dependency of the mind on structured certainty. It introduces a fixed interpretive anchor, and the mind completes the rest by forcing coherence onto randomness. Oedipus is not reacting to prophecy. He is reacting to the impossibility of existing without interpretation. His consciousness cannot leave uncertainty unresolved, so it continuously converts ambiguous signals into directional meaning, even when no direction objectively exists. A memory fragment appears here, a moment when scattered events, harmless in isolation, suddenly become part of a unified pattern once a single interpretive frame is accepted. The events do not change. Only their arrangement in the mind changes. And that rearrangement becomes irreversible. Now the insight expands. What we call fate is not a sequence of external outcomes. It is the internal enforcement of narrative closure. Once the mind commits to a coherent explanation, it begins to filter reality in a way that preserves that explanation, even at the cost of flexibility. This is why resistance fails. Not because the future is fixed, but because the mind cannot tolerate multiple futures existing simultaneously without collapsing into one dominant narrative. And once that collapse occurs, every action becomes an attempt to maintain coherence rather than explore possibility. Choice is still happening, but it is happening inside a constrained interpretive frame that has already eliminated most alternatives. Another memory fragment surfaces, a person looking back at a chain of neutral decisions and suddenly recognizing them as steps in a pattern that only exists because the conclusion is already known. The pattern feels real, but it is retroactively constructed. Now the consequence becomes unavoidable. If narrative stability overrides perceptual accuracy, then human beings are not primarily truth-seeking systems. They are coherence-seeking systems. And coherence, once prioritized above truth, begins to simulate inevitability even where none exists. The scale shifts dramatically. This is no longer about mythology or prophecy. This is about the architecture of cognition itself. Entire societies, belief systems, and historical interpretations can form around the same mechanism, the need to transform fragmented uncertainty into unified explanation. And once that transformation stabilizes, it feels indistinguishable from destiny. Here is the final expansion of insight. The oracle does not control outcomes. It reveals the point at which the mind begins to control itself through narrative necessity. The prophecy is not a command. It is a catalyst for coherence construction. Oedipus, then, becomes the archetype of a deeper condition, a mind that cannot remain in ambiguity long enough to see that ambiguity is not an error, but a feature of reality. And this leads to the most profound consequence of all. If the mind always resolves uncertainty into story, then the boundary between interpretation and inevitability may never be visible from inside the system itself. Which leaves only one philosophical rupture: if every perceived destiny is just narrative coherence solidifying itself over time, how would consciousness ever recognize the moment it is no longer choosing, but only completing a story it already believes is true? The consequence of a mind that cannot tolerate ambiguity is not confusion. It is inevitability. Because once consciousness commits to coherence as its highest priority, it begins to sacrifice alternative interpretations until only one structured meaning remains stable enough to survive internal pressure. And at that point, what we call choice is no longer exploration. It is maintenance of an already formed narrative. This is the lingering effect left behind by everything that came before. The oracle no longer matters as an external source. Its lasting impact is internal architecture change. It demonstrates that the human mind will always prioritize interpretive stability over perceptual openness, even when that stability narrows. Reality itself. A memory fragment reappears, reframed now with heavier meaning, a sequence of neutral events, once separate, gradually becoming inseparable in memory because the mind required a single coherent thread to hold them together. Not because the events demanded it, but because fragmentation was intolerable. This is the cost. Reality becomes simpler inside the mind, but only by losing its plurality. And that loss is not felt as loss. It is felt as clarity. Now the expansion of consequence moves beyond the individual. When this mechanism operates at scale, across communities or entire civilizations, shared narratives begin to form. Not because they are fully accurate, but because they are sufficiently coherent to stabilize collective perception. What begins as interpretation becomes structure. What begins as structure becomes assumption. And what begins as assumption becomes inherited truth. The legacy of Oedipus, then, is not a story about punishment or fate. It is a demonstration of how systems of meaning can outlive the events that created them. Once a narrative is complete enough, it no longer needs verification. It only needs repetition. Another memory fragment surfaces, a truth that was never directly experienced, but gradually accepted because it provided the only stable explanation that connected fragmented understanding into a single understandable shape. Now the scale shifts again. This is no longer about a single consciousness or even a single mythological framework. It becomes a model for how human beings construct historical inevitability. Looking backward, patterns appear flawless. Looking forward, uncertainty feels intolerable. And between these two directions, the mind builds a bridge that always feels like truth, even when it is only reconstruction. This is the deeper inheritance of the system. Not destiny as a force, but destiny as a retrospective design. The consequence is subtle but permanent. Once a coherent narrative is established, it begins to filter what future information is even allowed to feel credible. Anything that does not align with the structure is treated as noise, regardless of its accuracy. And so perception becomes self-reinforcing. What remains after this process is not truth in its raw form, but stabilized meaning that has survived every attempt at contradiction simply by absorbing or reinterpreting it. This is the legacy embedded inside the core conflict we have been following. A mind that cannot remain in ambiguity long enough to observe ambiguity itself will always convert possibility into certainty. And once certainty is formed, it begins to behave like inevitability, not because the future has been fixed, but because perception has already excluded every alternative that would prove otherwise. A final memory fragment appears, echoing the entire structure, a moment where uncertainty existed in its pure form, before being resolved into explanation, before being compressed into meaning, before becoming indistinguishable from memory itself. And this leads to the final reflection of this stage. If every civilization, every belief system, and every personal identity relies on the same mechanism of narrative stabilization, then what is actually being preserved through time is not truth, but the human need to survive uncertainty by transforming it into something that feels complete. which leaves one unresolved rupture hanging at the edge of everything we now understand. If coherence always wins over ambiguity, even at the cost of distortion, then is human understanding ever a path toward truth, or only a continuous escape from the discomfort of not having one? What remains at the end is not the certainty of fate, and not the illusion of escape, but the recognition that human consciousness is always negotiating with its own need to close the open space of uncertainty. And once that recognition settles, everything shifts in a quiet but irreversible way. Because the final insight is not about prophecy, and not about Oedipus as an individual figure trapped in a mythological framework. It is about the condition that makes such frameworks possible in the first place, the mind's inability to live indefinitely inside unresolved ambiguity. This is the silent architecture beneath the entire experience. A memory fragment returns for the last time, a moment when scattered signals of reality had not yet been forced into a single story, when events still existed as isolated possibilities rather than connected inevitabilities. Nothing was decided yet. Everything was still open. And that openness itself was unstable. That instability is the key. Human perception does not simply observe reality. It continuously organizes it into survivable meaning. Not because truth is inaccessible, but because unprocessed uncertainty feels like cognitive free fall. So the mind builds structure. Then it forgets it built the structure at all. This is where the legacy of the story truly lives. Not in the idea of punishment, and not in the idea of divine design, but in the realization that meaning is not discovered like an object. It is assembled like a shelter. And once assembled, it begins to define what can and cannot be seen from inside it. The figure at the center of the narrative becomes something larger than myth. Not a victim of destiny, but a reflection of a universal cognitive reflex, the transformation of ambiguity into narrative necessity. And once necessity enters perception, alternatives begin to disappear, not because they are destroyed, but because they are no longer recognizable as possibilities. Another memory fragment surfaces faintly, a sequence of decisions that only appear connected when viewed from the end, where the conclusion quietly reshapes the memory of the beginning, giving the illusion that the path was always visible. This is the enduring human pattern. We do not experience life as raw uncertainty. We experience it as meaning in motion. And that meaning, once formed, becomes powerful enough to rewrite the emotional weight of everything that led to it. So the legacy is not a warning about fate. It is a mirror reflecting the cost of needing coherence more than openness, certainty more than ambiguity, an explanation more than presence within the unknown. And this is where the reflection becomes universal. If the mind is always turning what it cannot hold into what it can understand, then every human story is partially a reconstruction, shaped not only by what happened, but by the necessity of making what happened feel complete. Which means the deepest question is no longer about whether destiny exists outside us. It is about whether the need for closure inside us is the quiet force that turns possibility into something that only looks like inevitability. And if that need is always present, always active, always shaping what reality can become in our awareness, then the question that remains is simple, but unresolved. When we believe we are understanding the world, are we actually seeing what is there, or only the final shape our mind creates to survive not knowing?